Before hell had a name, before judgment, fire, and eternal punishment, there was something else. A realm older than heaven's laws and deeper than human memory. Ancient texts and forbidden myths whisper of the Shadow Kingdom, a place not created for evil, but for possibility. This is where beings were formed before morality existed, before good and evil were defined. Not fallen angels, not demons as we know them, but entities born in the silence between creation and order. Tonight, we peel back the veil and uncover the forgotten realm where demons didn't fall from heaven. They were left behind. Before hell existed, the Shadow Kingdom where demons truly came from. Long before hell was imagined as a place of fire, punishment, and eternal judgment, ancient traditions spoke of something far older and far more mysterious. A realm not born from rebellion or sin, but from unfinished creation. This forgotten domain is often hinted at in myth, apocryphal texts, and esoteric traditions. A primordial world, sometimes called the Shadow Kingdom. According to these sources, demons did not originate as evil beings cast down from heaven, but as entities formed before moral law itself existed. To understand demons, then we must first understand a time before hell, before judgment, and before good and evil were defined. A time before moral judgment. In most modern religious thought, existence is neatly divided. Heaven above, hell below, and humanity caught in between. But ancient cosmologies were not so simple. Many early belief systems described multiple layers of reality, some of which predated divine law. These early realms were not governed by morality, but by potential. Before commandments, before covenants, before divine courts, existence itself was still being shaped. Creation was not yet complete. Order had not fully triumphed over chaos. It was in this unfinished state that the Shadow Kingdom emerged, a realm formed not as a prison, but as a byproduct of creation. In this age, beings were not judged as good or evil. They simply were. They embodied forces, instincts, and raw aspects of existence. Hunger, curiosity, power, fear, desire, survival. These beings did not rebel against God, because rebellion requires law, and law had not yet been established. The Shadow Kingdom, a realm of leftovers. The Shadow Kingdom is best understood as a cosmic remainder. Everything that did not fit neatly into the ordered universe once creation was finalized. When divine order was established, boundaries were drawn. Light was separated from darkness. Heaven was defined. Earth was shaped. But not everything found a place in this new structure. Ancient myths across cultures speak of realms of twilight, mist, or shadow, places between worlds. The Mesopotamians spoke of Irkalla. The Greeks spoke of Tartarus and chaos. Jewish mystical traditions describe primordial realms like Tohu, formlessness. Gnostic texts describe shadow worlds ruled by lesser beings. These are not hell as later theology defines it, but pre-hell realms, spaces of exile through irrelevance rather than punishment. The Shadow Kingdom was not designed to torture. It was designed to contain. It became the place where beings formed before divine order were stored when the universe moved on without them. Beings born of possibility, not evil. The entities that would later be called demons were not originally malevolent. They were primordial intelligences, shaped by possibility rather than purpose. Some were curious. Some were predatory. Some were creative. Some were destructive. But none were evil in the moral sense, because morality had not yet been imposed. These beings were incomplete, not flawed, but unfinished. They had awareness without guidance, power without direction, consciousness without law. When divine order solidified, these beings could not adapt. They did not fit into heaven, which now required obedience. They could not exist on earth, which was reserved for humanity. And so they were excluded. Exile came not as a punishment, but as a consequence of incompatibility, the birth of fear and the rise of demonization. Over time, humanity became aware of these shadow beings, not through open interaction, but through interference. Dreams, whispers, unexplained impulses, visions, possession myths, sudden inspiration, and irrational fear were all attributed to forces beyond human understanding. As religious systems evolved, these encounters required explanation. Once moral frameworks were established, anything outside divine order was labeled evil. What had once been neutral became dangerous. What had once been ancient became forbidden. Thus, the beings of the Shadow Kingdom were redefined. They were no longer primordial entities left behind. They became demons. Their realm was no longer a forgotten world. It became hell. But this hell was a later reinterpretation, not the original reality. Hell as a system, not an origin. Hell, as commonly understood, is a system of judgment. It exists after moral law. It requires sin, guilt, and punishment. That alone tells us hell could not be the original home of demons. Instead, hell appears to be a repurposing of the Shadow Kingdom. Once divine law was established, the Shadow Kingdom was no longer just a storage realm. It became a boundary, a place to confine that which opposed order, even if that opposition was unintentional. Over time, theological narratives reshaped the Shadow Kingdom into a prison. Demons were no longer misunderstood beings. They were enemies. Their existence was reframed as rebellion rather than abandonment. Fallen angels versus forgotten beings. A crucial distinction must be made between fallen angels and shadow beings. Fallen angels, according to religious texts, rebelled after divine law was established. They knew the rules and chose to defy them. Demons, however, often behave in ways that suggest something older, something less ideological and more instinctual. Many ancient demon descriptions portray beings driven by hunger, curiosity, or influence rather than pure malice. They tempt, manipulate, whisper, and intrude, but rarely with a grand moral agenda. This behavior aligns more closely with beings that were never taught restraint, not beings that consciously rejected it. This supports the idea that many demons are not fallen angels at all, but primordial entities from the Shadow Kingdom, later absorbed into religious narratives for simplicity and control. Humanity's role in their transformation. Human belief itself played a role in reshaping these beings. As humanity developed language, myth, and theology, it projected meaning onto the unknown. Fear gave form to shadows. Stories solidified into doctrine. Over centuries, the Shadow Kingdom became synonymous with evil because humanity needed clear opposites. Light versus dark, good versus evil, heaven versus hell. But in doing so, something was lost, the memory of a time before these binaries existed. Some mystical traditions suggest that belief feeds these entities, that fear strengthens them, that naming them as evil locks them into that role. If demons were once undefined, then humanity may have helped define them into monsters. The Shadow Kingdom as a living realm. Unlike hell, which is often described as static and punitive, the Shadow Kingdom is portrayed in ancient traditions as dynamic. It shifts, adapts, and responds. It is closer to a parallel reality than a dungeon. Some texts describe it as existing alongside the physical world, overlapping at certain points: deserts, ruins, deep forests, oceans, and dreams. This explains why demons are often associated with liminal spaces, places that are neither fully ordered nor fully wild. The Shadow Kingdom is not beneath the earth in a literal sense. It exists outside the map of creation, a realm not erased, but ignored. Why the Shadow Kingdom still matters. If demons truly originated from a realm that predates hell, then our understanding of good and evil becomes more complex. Evil is no longer just rebellion. It can also be displacement. Darkness is not always chosen. Sometimes it is inherited. This perspective does not excuse harm, but it reframes origin. It suggests that some forces in the universe are not evil by intent, but dangerous by nature, like fire, storms, or the ocean. Understanding the Shadow Kingdom forces us to confront an uncomfortable idea, that creation itself involved loss, that order required exclusion, that not everything made at the beginning was meant to survive the final design. A forgotten chapter of creation. The Shadow Kingdom stands as a forgotten chapter in the story of existence. A realm that existed before names, laws, and judgment. A place where beings were shaped by possibility rather than purpose. From its depths emerged entities that would later be feared as demons, not because they were born evil, but because they were left behind when the universe moved on. To understand this chapter is to step outside the familiar framework of good and evil, and into a time when creation itself was unfinished. It is to confront the idea that not everything excluded from divine order was rebellious. Some things were simply early, before names were given. In many ancient traditions, naming is an act of authority. To name something is to define it, to limit it, to place it within a structure of meaning. The Shadow Kingdom existed before naming, before language divided reality into categories. In this primordial state, beings were not called angels, demons, spirits, or gods. They were expressions of raw existence, forces, intelligences, tendencies. They did not carry identities in the way later beings would. They shifted, adapted, and changed according to their environment. This explains why early myths often describe ancient beings as shapeless, shadow-like, or difficult to perceive. They were not meant to be seen through the lens of later order. They existed before reality learned how to describe itself. When names finally came, these beings were already out of place. Creation as a process, not a moment. Modern theology often presents creation as a single, completed act. Ancient cosmologies tell a different story. Creation was a process, unfolding in stages, with corrections, revisions, and abandonments. The Shadow Kingdom belongs to an early phase of this process, a stage where potential outweighed precision. Reality was experimenting. Possibilities were tested. Some endured. Others did not. When divine order crystallized, when laws replaced potential, the universe narrowed its focus. Stability became more important than exploration. Harmony replaced experimentation. And anything that could not conform was pushed aside. The Shadow Kingdom became the holding space for those early creations that no longer fit. Beings shaped by possibility. Unlike later beings who were created with specific roles, the entities of the Shadow Kingdom were shaped by possibility. They were not designed to obey, serve, or govern. They were allowed to become. Some grew intelligent. Others became instinctual. Some learned to influence reality subtly. Others learned to consume energy, emotion, or attention. Without law to guide them, they followed whatever patterns emerged naturally. This lack of imposed purpose is crucial. Purpose requires intention. Intention requires authority. At this stage of creation, authority had not yet fully asserted itself. These beings were not flawed, they were free. But freedom without structure can become dangerous once structure appears elsewhere. The arrival of law and judgment. The introduction of divine law changed everything. Once order was declared, existence became moralized. Actions were no longer neutral. Alignment mattered. Obedience became a requirement. Purpose replaced possibility. Beings created after this moment were designed to function within the system. Angels had roles. Humans had boundaries. Nature followed laws. The Shadow Kingdom beings, however, were incompatible with this new reality. They could not be judged by laws they were never meant to follow. Yet they could not be allowed to roam freely either. Thus, judgment was applied retroactively. This is where misunderstanding began, from forgotten to feared. When humanity later encountered traces of these beings, through dreams, altered states, or unexplained phenomena, they did so through a moral framework that did not exist when those beings were created. What could not be categorized was labeled dangerous. What could not be controlled was labeled evil. Over generations, stories changed. Neutral forces became malicious. Forgotten entities became enemies. The Shadow Kingdom transformed in human memory from a forgotten realm into a forbidden one. Fear replaced curiosity. Demons were not born evil. They were reinterpreted as evil. Demons as survivors of an earlier world. Seen through this lens, demons are not rebels, but survivors. They come from a version of reality that no longer exists. Their instincts, behaviors, and nature are adapted to a world without law. This explains why demons in ancient stories often behave inconsistently. Some teach knowledge. Some guard thresholds. Some test humans. Some harm indiscriminately. There is no unified agenda, only survival within a system that rejects them. They are remnants of an abandoned design. The Shadow Kingdom and liminal space. The Shadow Kingdom is not simply a place, it is a condition. It exists wherever order thins. This is why shadow entities are associated with deserts, ruins, night, wilderness, crossroads, and dreams. These are spaces that exist between definitions. Not fully ordered. Not fully chaotic. In such places, the boundaries between worlds weaken. The Shadow Kingdom presses close. Its inhabitants slip through, not as invaders, but as echoes. They do not belong here, yet nowhere else will hold them. Why memory was erased? If the Shadow Kingdom predates judgment, why was its memory lost? Because, remembering, it threatens certainty. A universe that once existed without moral division undermines absolute narratives of good and evil. It suggests that darkness is not always chosen. That exclusion can create monsters. That divine order came at a cost. For organized belief systems, such ambiguity is dangerous. So the Shadow Kingdom was simplified, rewritten, buried beneath clearer stories of rebellion and punishment. History was replaced with theology, humanity's reflection in the Shadow Kingdom. The Shadow Kingdom is unsettling because it mirrors humanity's own fears. Humans, too, create systems that exclude. Societies cast out those who do not fit. Cultures demonize what they do not understand. Over time, the excluded become hostile, not by nature, but by survival. In this sense, demons are not just ancient beings, they are reflections. They show what happens when existence moves on and leaves something behind. The Shadow Kingdom is creation's shadow, the cost of order, the silence after creation. Unlike hell, which is described with noise, fire, screams, punishment, the Shadow Kingdom is described with silence. Silence implies forgetting. These beings were not punished, they were ignored. And neglect, over eternity, can be more destructive than wrath. In silence, they learn to listen, to whisper, to influence rather than confront, to survive in the cracks of reality. This is why demons rarely appear openly. They are subtle, indirect, adaptive. They learned long ago that force invites destruction, a chapter not meant to be read. The Shadow Kingdom was not erased because it was evil. It was erased because it complicated the story. Yet traces remain. In myths that contradict doctrine. in scriptures that hint at older worlds, in traditions that speak of beings older than angels, in stories that cannot quite explain where demons truly came from. These are fragments of a chapter torn from the beginning of existence, remembering what came before. To remember the Shadow Kingdom is not to glorify it. It is to acknowledge that creation was not simple, that order required sacrifice, that not everything lost was wrong. It reminds us that evil is sometimes the result of abandonment, not intention, that darkness can be inherited, that beings shaped by possibility struggle in a world ruled by purpose. The Shadow Kingdom stands as a warning, not of rebellion, but of forgetting. The forgotten chapter endures. The universe may have moved on, but the Shadow Kingdom remains. It exists in the margins of reality, in the unanswered questions, in the inconsistencies of myth. It watches from the edges of creation, not seeking redemption, not demanding worship, but enduring. Before hell existed, there was no punishment, only exclusion. Before demons were feared, they were unfinished. Before judgment, there was possibility. And that forgotten chapter still echoes through existence, reminding us that the story of creation did not begin with perfection, but with experimentation, loss, and shadow. The Shadow Kingdom is not the opposite of heaven. It is what heaven left behind. So when we speak of demons, we must ask ourselves, are they truly evil, or are they echoes of a forgotten age? The Shadow Kingdom reminds us that not all darkness was born from rebellion. Some were simply abandoned when the universe chose order over possibility. Before hell existed, before judgment and punishment, there was exile through forgetting. And perhaps the greatest fear is not fire or torment, but being erased from the story of creation itself. If this hidden realm still lingers in the shadows, watching, waiting, then the line between myth and memory may be thinner than we think.